Let's now imagine that we wanted to get some data about 3 countries at the same time, but in which the order that the data arrives does not matter at all. So let's now implement an async function using everything that we know at this point. And this function will simply take in 3 countries, and it will log the capital cities of these 3 countries as an array. So let's say get 3 countries. And again, it's an async function. So country 1, 2, and 3. And then in an async function, we really always need to wrap our code into a try catch block. Okay. So never work an async function without this. And again, in a real world scenario, you would do real error handling and not just log it to the console. Okay, so await, and then let's use our getJSON function that we coded at some point at the beginning of this section. So here at the top of my file, I have this getJSON function, which, remember, encapsulates the fetch request, the error handling also. So basically, when there is an error in this fetch, it will throw a new error, and it also immediately converts the response to JSON. So again, if you skipped one of the previous lectures, then make sure to get this function from the final code of this section. So get JSON, and then here again, we're using our REST countries API. So let me get the URL. So here we now will use C1. And so then we store that data into a variable just like this. So this is the magic of async await, right? Now we already know that the result of this is going to be an array with one object. So let's use the structuring to take the first element there. And now let's simply duplicate this code here twice and do this 3 times. So creating 3 variables for these 3 countries. And then what we want to get is the capital. So now let's say data1.capital, because there is such a property in each of these objects. And so remember that we want to return an array here. And so that's what we're doing. And data3.capital as well. And so this should actually already work. All right, so let's call this function get 3 countries. Let's use Portugal again, and Canada, and maybe Tanzania, which is a very beautiful country. Oh, and here we get something went wrong. So Portugal. So missing the G. And yeah, so here we get the 3 capital cities of the 3 countries. So great, this works just fine. And also at a first sight, this seems to make sense. But if we think about what we did here, then maybe it actually doesn't make so much sense. Because what we did here basically was to run all these AJAX calls one after another, even though the result of the second one here does not depend on the first one. And the result of the third one does also not depend on any of the other ones. And so actually this doesn't make much sense. Why should the second AJAX call wait for the first one? And actually, let's take a look at this in our network tab here as well. So let's again maybe set this to slow 3G now. And then I will have to make it a little bit smaller so that we can actually see something down here. Okay, so down here, we actually have the 3 AJAX calls. So let's use fast 3G here actually. And so let's see what happens. And so basically these bars that you see here is JavaScript downloading something. So here, of course, the first one is the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So nothing strange there. But then here we load the data for Portugal, right? So that's the first AJAX call. And then after that is finished, we load the data for Canada. And then after that is finished, we load the data for Tanzania. So just as we have it here in the code, and so as I explained, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So instead of running these promises in sequence, we can actually run them in parallel, so all at the same time. And so then we can save valuable loading time, making these three here basically load at the same time. And each of them takes half a second. And so with that, we will basically save 1 second, which is actually a lot of time when loading a website. So let's do that. And for doing that, we use the promise.all combinator function. So promise.all. And so this is once again kind of a helper function on this promise constructor. So it's a static method, right? Now this function here takes in an array of promises and it will return a new promise, which will then run all the promises in the array at the same time. So let's simply grab these 3 promises from here. So 1, then here the second one, and this is the third one. Okay, so here we again have these 3 running. But you immediately saw the Portugal, Canada, and Tanzania already running another time, but at the same time, right? So I only wanted to show you this later, but now here it is already. But for now, let's keep focusing on making this work. So as I said, this here will return a new promise. So a promise that runs all of these promises at the same time. And so then we can handle that promise in the exact same way as before. So let's call the result data and then await it here. And then log the data to the console. So this one we also don't need anymore. So we want to log the data. And so, yeah, you see once again that these 3 now loaded exactly at the same time. So they are running in parallel and no longer in sequence now. So that's all I wanted to show you. So let's go back here. Okay, and so indeed here we get the result. So an array, which in this case returns 3 arrays, and each of them is of course the object we're looking for. And so promise.all receives an array and it also returns an array. And so to create the same output as before, now all we have to do is to loop over this data and take out the data that we want. So console.log, then data.map, because remember that we want to actually return an array, but not this array, but simply an array with all the capital cities. So in this array of data, each element, let's call it D, which stands for data. So D is now this single array. So from D, we want to take element 0, and then on there, we want the capital city. And so this should be it. And yeah, here we get the exact same result as before. Now, just one thing that's also very important to mention here is that if one of the promises rejects, then the whole promise.all actually rejects as well. So we say that promise.all short circuits when one promise rejects. So again, because one rejected promise is enough for the entire thing to reject as well. Great. So whenever you have a situation in which you need to do multiple asynchronous operations at the same time, and operations that don't depend on one another, then you should always run them in parallel, just like we did here, using promise.all. And this is actually more common than you might think, and so please keep this technique in mind, because your users will thank you. And of course, just in case you're not using async await, you can of course also take this result here and then handle it with the then method. So that's going to work just exactly the same as here with async await. Okay, and that's the promise.all combinator. So it's called a combinator function because it allows us to combine multiple promises. And there are actually other combinator functions, and so let's take a look at them right in the next video.